right, boys and girls, so we are going to spend some time each day focusing on grammar. I know that we did that a while back, but kind of getting into a routine now of spending a few minutes each day working on these different pieces. So for today, we're going to take a look at some pronouns and adverbs. You've heard these words before, right? Teachers have talked to you about pronouns and adverbs. But what exactly do we need to know about pronouns and adverbs? Well, there's a few more fancy words I'm going to mention in this video, but just try to focus and follow along because when we get to the examples, I know that this will make a lot more sense. So let's look right here. It says that a clause, so I'm going to put a box around this word, a clause is a group of words with a subject and a predicate. Okay. So a group of words with a subject, who or what the sentence is about, and the predicate, what they're doing. Some sentences include a dependent clause, which depends on or gives more information about the main clause. So again, a lot of things presented here, right? A main clause and a dependent clause. We're going to take a look at those in just a moment. A dependent clause cannot stand alone in a sentence, so you can't have just the dependent clause. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at this first example here. Some restaurants offer meals that come from different countries. So the main clause is that some restaurants offer meals. The dependent clause, remember the definition up here? A dependent clause gives more information about the main clause. Well, if we know that some restaurants offer meals, now we're going to learn a little bit more about that come from different countries. Let's take a look at a few more. There was a word in this dependent clause right here that was an example of a pronoun. Pronouns include words like who, whose, whom, or which. Can also be the word that. These pronouns often are words that introduce a dependent clause. For example, I can see this pronoun right here. That come from different countries. When we use the words like who, whose, and whom, we're talking about people. Now, that makes sense. When we use words like that or which, we're talking about things or places. For example, in this first sentence, we're talking about restaurants and we're talking about different countries. So, places. So we use the pronoun that. I know it's probably still a little bit confusing. I promise it'll get better as we go through examples. Stay with me. Many immigrants have a recipe that they brought from another country. So again, your main clause is that many immigrants have a recipe. Now, our focus in this sentence is the recipe. So our dependent clause is going to be that they brought from another country. Again, it gives us more information about the main clause, which is focused on the recipe. So we use that pronoun that. Let's look at another example. The recipe may have come from relatives who lived long ago. So now, in the second example, our focus has shifted from the recipe to now coming from relatives. And our dependent clause, again, gives us a little bit more information about the main clause, and we're saying that these are people who lived long ago. So we're using that pronoun who because we're talking about people, relatives. Hopefully it's starting to make a little more sense. Let's continue. You might use adverbs such as where or when or why to introduce a dependent clause. Let's look at this example. When Gina's parents lived in Italy, they owned restaurants. What's your main clause here? Well, you're focused on that they owned restaurants, but if you want to know more about it, you learned that they owned the restaurants when they lived in Italy. So we use the adverb when to give us more information about our main clause. So what does that look like for fourth graders then? You know, Mrs. Bodies talked about the rules really, but what does that look like? So now we have 6 examples. We have to underline the dependent clause in each sentence. So we're going to underline that part in each sentence. And then we have to circle the pronoun or the adverb that introduces the clauses. So we have to circle the pronoun or the adverb that they're using to introduce the clause. So let's look first at example number 1. I'm going to read this to you and then give you a second to think. Chinese restaurants are popular in San Francisco, where many Chinese Americans live. Think first to yourself, what is the main clause? Right, the main clause is that Chinese restaurants are popular in San Francisco. Now, the dependent clause, remember, tells us just a little bit more about that main clause. So what else did we learn about these Chinese restaurants in San Francisco? Right, where many Chinese Americans live. There is a pronoun. Can you find it? That's right, the word where. Let's look at example number 2. People who live in the Northeast can enjoy wonderful Italian restaurants. Think to yourself, what is the main clause? Great. We're talking about people, and they can enjoy wonderful Italian restaurants. I guess I shouldn't have underlined that. I should stay consistent. The sentence is all about people and how they can enjoy wonderful Italian restaurants. So we learned something else about it, didn't we? That's right. Who live in the Northeast. That's what we added to our understanding of the main clause. Let's try one more. Tex-Mex, which became popular in the 1950s, is a blend of Mexican and American food. So your main clause explains really what Tex-Mex is, right? It's a blend of Mexican and American food. But what was the additional piece of information that you learned about Tex-Mex food? Exactly. So that's your dependent clause. It's just giving you that extra little bit of information, which became popular in the 1950s. We did use a pronoun, and it is the word which. So you guys are going to have 4 multiple choice questions where you have to identify the pronoun that introduces the dependent clause. These are going to be on Schoology. They are all multiple choice questions. And let me know if you have any questions.